So the war's progression by middle end of 1916 was quite frustrating to all the belligerents. It wasn't clear to anybody how exactly this is ever going to end. Falkenhayn's big idea wasn't really working, and he eventually gets demoted or kind of shuffled to the side by Germany and replaced by Erich Ludendorff and Paul Hindenburg, who became essentially joint commanders of the German military as well as joint leaders, dictatorial leaders of Germany, in order to try to marshal the war effort of Germany. Things are getting worse in Germany by 1917 in terms of availability of goods. They're having more problems getting goods through the blockade. By 1918, it would get epidemic. There was different ways people thought maybe somebody can break through the stalemate. So the Eastern Campaign, if you look in the links, which have the visual history chapters, the Eastern Campaign is where things actually moved. The soldiers would actually move more than a few miles. They would. That was the more of the battles of action, and we don't focus as much because most of the press from the time and so most of our sources come from the Western Front. And if any of you are interested in becoming historians and learning various Eastern European languages, including Russian, there's probably some good stuff to be written on the Eastern campaigns of the First World War, and then going more into the Russian Civil War, which there's less English language stuff about those. But generally speaking, Russia tried its best to be honorable to its allies, which, unlike Italy and some of those other countries or even the United States when it entered the war, didn't always fulfill their promises. And Russia, to its credit, actually did. France was its traditional ally, and well, not traditional, but ally since the 19th century. And when France called for their help, they tried to help. And so the Brusilov offensive was about that. When the Russian Revolution happens, they still try to stay in the war, which was bad idea. So allied action, maybe there can be some pressure released off the Western Front, and that would allow one side to break through. So Brusilov offensive was successful at first, then not so successful. Romanian campaign. Romania thought it would get pieces of its lost territory from the Balkan Wars earlier in the 20th and then back in the 19th century, thought it would maybe gain something from Austria-Hungary, and then Romania's troops were so ridiculously underprepared and ill equipped that they just got defeated absurdly, even by the weakened Austro-Hungarian armies. And so they basically didn't do anything worthwhile. The Italians and the Austro-Hungarians went back and forth in the Isonzo, and then later capping off what was called the Battle of Caporetto. Later on in the following year, 1917, which basically canceled out Italy and Austria-Hungary. So that wasn't going to win the war. The British thought, maybe we can help end the war by knocking out a German ally, Central Power ally, in the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman Empire kind of lost and lost and lost. It tended to lose to Russia. Back and forth in different parts of the campaign. There was a whole campaign in northern Turkey in the Erzurum, which is on the Black Sea, and the Russians and Turks went back and forth. The Russians were relatively successful there, unlike in Poland and other parts or the Carpathian Front. In the Middle East, it was, and you can look at your book about this. There was a guy named Lawrence of Arabia who ended up becoming an excellent guerrilla fighter and an organizer that organized the various Arab factions to fight back against the Ottoman Empire, which succeeded, and they took over some port cities and took over basically all the big cities in what's now Iraq and Saudi Arabia, and push the Ottoman Empire out of there. But that didn't turn the tide of the war enough to win, although it was a big blow to the Ottoman Empire. Would the U.S. join? That was a big question. the Europeans very much wanted the U.S. to join and join on the Allied side. The Germans tried what they could to try to extend American neutrality, but it was clear by 1915, really, America's not neutral. It's just, are they going to actually send troops? Most Americans didn't want to, but although some did, if Theodore Roosevelt had been president and had his way, U.S. would have been in the war much earlier. But the U.S. position under the President Woodrow Wilson generally was, we will help equip our European allies, France and Britain. We will not fight for them. And that continued, but it was clear, as Germany recognized the U.S. was a co-belligerent in a way by sending so much material, they eventually had to start attacking the merchant shipping. And that got the U.S. into the war. Could technology change things? There were various efforts to improve the military technology, but again, the thinking wasn't quite there, and the technology didn't advance enough. And so there were better planes, certainly much better planes developed during the war. Eventually, tanks developed. Tanks were the kind of the big technological breakthrough that the British thought they had that would end the war, and that didn't work for them. The tanks were too slow. The first tanks, they couldn't communicate with each other, so they literally used pigeons. They would keep, the tank commanders would keep a cage of pigeons in the tank, and you'd send the pigeons with little notes to try to to communicate with the commanders, so that then there'd be these signals or something that they'd send back to the tanks to get the tanks to move. And they were so slow. They only went like 4 miles an hour, 5 miles an hour. And I'll get to the tanks in a minute. But they were an idea that were ahead of their time, but not advanced enough to change the balance of power in the war. U-boats were something that could have, again, the technology not quite there to change the whole course of the war, but the Germans did start more aggressively using U-boats by 1917. So technology didn't seem to improve. There were technological advancements that helped make the soldiers more deadly. Rifles got better. The artillery continued getting better. The soldiers started wearing better equipment that would protect their heads from shrapnel and things like that. But again, none of the technological advances seem to be game changers. The U.S. joining would have been the big game changer. Something that was not a game changer, and I'm sorry to all any of you guys that might have been, or guys or gals that might have been Navy veterans, but the naval forces in the First World War were quite useless. And this is particularly, I don't know what people in, I should look up what people in the Navy must have thought about this, but the naval forces were so much a part of what had caused the war, the buildup of these things, and then you never actually used them. In some cases, you would actually take the guns off and then transport them and use them on the front, which is what they did in Verdun, with some naval weaponry that was supposed to go on ships, instead went to the front. Floating gun platforms, the battleships, battle cruisers, the cruisers, these were floating gun holders, and they were too afraid to use, all the powers were too afraid to use them, but especially Germany was too afraid to use them. And they did use it at one battle, which this is an image of. These are British battleships at the Battle of Jutland, which was almost an accidental battle between the German High Seas Fleet and the main the main portion of the British Royal Fleet. And they did fight each other, and it was a tactical victory for the Germans. The Germans shot better, and they sunk I think 1 or 2 battleships and a few they sunk something like 7 big ships at the Battle of Jutland. I could look up exactly how many it was. And the British only took out, I think, 2 or 3 of the Germans' big ships, but they never did. The big ones never came into contact with each other too much. All that money, all those resources that go into building these things for years, all the people that served on them. Each one of these ships would have crews of like 2,000, which were not, it was not comfortable, believe me. If you want to see what one of them looks like, there's only one Dreadnought era battleship which still exists, which is the, or one Dreadnought class battleship. That was, it's called the Battleship Texas, actually. It's moored in outside Houston, Texas, which I think they're having to fix it right now because the thing was falling apart. It was sinking, and they're having to fix it up. But and then there's a couple of the British cruisers that you can still go see. They're cramped, horrible things to stay in. Would have been really hot in there. But you're afraid to put them to use. And so the Battle of Jutland was the largest naval engagement in terms of the number of ships that faced off with each other, like 100 German ships and like 160 British ships. And they never did bring them to bear, and because both sides were too afraid to put their ships at risk. Had the Germans actually gone forward with an all-out battle, and they would have lost. Essentially, the way naval gunfire works, when you have more numbers, you win. So the British would have won that, and it would have been terrible for Germany. So Germany took their fleet, put it right back where it sat in the harbor for the rest of the war. So naval action is not going to win this. The Germans doubled down on U-boats. So more and more, there's kind of a despondency. You see more criticism, and there were more protests against the war in different parts of the world. The U.S. a lot of Americans didn't want to get into it. France was pretty good at holding down its protests. Britain started to see more, and then they were dealing with the Easter Rising of the Irish also around the same time, which is problematic for them. So this image, called The Deserter by Boardman Robinson, who was a Canadian artist living in America at the time, it kind of demonstrates that there's, we're fighting for the sake of fighting, and we're killing everything that we believe in. And how is this ever going to resolve? Oh, I forgot to mention Battle of the Somme. One element that came out of that was the use of underground mines, and so there was this tunnel warfare also going on. This would be used in other battles, such as the Battle of Messines Ridge in 1917, in which they'd dig underneath, try to get underneath the trench, and then blow a whole bunch of explosives up. It would cause a huge earthquake, but it wouldn't actually do much, although some of these detonations of the mines at the Somme battlefield did kill a decent number of German soldiers. It was the British who planned this. And but after the initial confusion, the reconstitution of the front happened pretty quickly. So the underground warfare, which was terrifying to have been involved in, also did not work. So that was another piece of technology that wouldn't work. Going into the last couple years of the war, you've just gone all through these ordeals of Verdun and the Somme, and Russia trying to take pressure off and that not working, getting pushed back, and Romania and Bulgaria trying to continue fighting and them failing, Italy not really doing much with Austria-Hungary. And so the whole thing just looks like, good Lord, stalemate's going to continue on and on and on and on. And at this point, it's starting to get quite distressing on how it's ever going to be resolved. And the propaganda is so forth, and this is one of the tragedies of the war. The propaganda is getting so ridiculously insane to keep people motivated to fight the war, because your whole society is at war. The propaganda demonized the other side so much in that the people coming, even when the war ended, you were crazed by the propaganda. It was just so intense. You got to think that your enemies were so inhuman, so animals, not people to be respected. And so the peace was waged in this context of propaganda being absurdly horrifying in terms of convincing people to be brutal, or to condone brutality.